You know, a few things about that. First of all, what's interesting is I was a big science fiction reader in high school when I was growing up. And all of these questions have been asked in science fiction, at least for decades. And they're all scenarios that we've woven in literature to try to answer them. The question of AI destroying humanity is a question way down the line, and we can all think about it theoretically. And it makes a lot of assumptions that we don't even know are true, that AI will ever have that power, that AI will be self-aware enough to make that decision, that so all of those things may or may not be true. And I talk about, by the way, those kinds of questions, and we have a fun time with them. And there is a whole field of AI that looks at the question of how we get AI to think about human beings once it gets to the point that it's thinking about human beings. Few things to say about that. First of all, AI is nowhere even close to that. Now, AI primarily right now does very specific things. It helps, look at mortgage applications and it does very specific. This sort of general AI that could destroy the world, we're decades away from that. And AI builds incrementally. That is, we build AI from AI is made up of algorithms, and these are algorithms built on algorithms. And humans make the algorithms. At least for now, there is a possibility of AI building its own algorithms. Some AIs can already build simple algorithms. So we can build in protections of whatever kind we want. When we talk about AI ethics these days, though that is a part of it, that's not really what we're dealing with. AI ethics at this level asks questions like, how do we protect people's privacy when AI is this enormous consumer of data and all of our personal information is in that data? How do we prevent biases? Because the data that AI uses to generate its decisions is data that human beings have created, and it is always biased because humans cannot create unbiased data. How do we think about AI and job displacement? Because AI is already threatening to replace many, many different kinds of jobs, whether we're talking about automated cars replacing drivers, or whether we're talking about sophisticated algorithms able to read x-rays, sometimes better than radiologists can. So white collar, blue collar, I mean, across the board, AI can already read contracts, and in fact, catches problems in contracts often better than human readers do. So we're not just talking about, usually when we talk about technology replacing people, we're talking about laborers and things like that. But AI, it's across the board. We're talking about AI replacing skilled labor and even educated labor that depends on high education. Those are the kinds of questions that we're asking around AI these days. It's fun to talk about AI 50 years from now taking over the world, but we have some actual important, really difficult AI questions right now. AI is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Every single person listening to this uses AI every day in their GPS, in their smartphones, when they make phone calls into companies, and especially whenever they go on the web and buy something or go onto a website where it's all around us. And it has powers over us that are not obvious, that people don't see that easily. And that raises all kinds of ethical challenges.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack with this that I think is absolutely fascinating for people to talk about. Perhaps because it is, like you said, still a couple of years out, it's still fascinating for us to talk about. Maybe when this is, a humanitarian crisis, we'll be less happy about it, of course. But, one of the first thing I wanted to ask about was when you mentioned at the start, you, as a reader of sci-fi, have read a lot of stories, and there are a ton of stories that deal with this problem. I mean, I'm just thinking about, the common ones that have so many instances of AI that deal with it, the sci-fi TV shows all the way from Star Trek to Stargate, all these different ones, they explore these issues. Is it kind of fun as a bioethicist to be able to have this fictional, almost a testing ground where people can make some assumptions because they don't know what's going to happen. So they can make some assumptions that are going to happen, and then they can try to play the story out with characters that they create. And you're almost having this as a kind of a, preemptive case study, no matter how unrealistic it is, to explore.
I'll go even deeper than that. So you're absolutely right. And there are courses that have been taught by colleagues of mine, and I've taught courses. AI and ethics in Star Trek is a course. It's been taught. But we have a program at my ethics center called Ethics in the Arts. And in it, we use theater, movies, all kinds of things. There is no, I'm going to make a kind of bold statement. There are no plays and there are no movies that don't have an ethical dilemma as part of what generates the interest and tension of them. And that's what makes them interesting, is some ethical problem. Even shoot 'em ups, even slapstick comedy has some ethical problem. Even Charlie Chaplin eating that shoe leather is about poverty and hunger and our responsibility. You can get ethical questions generated out of almost any good art. And I would go further and say even visual arts are often, it's a little more difficult, but even there, you can pull ethical dilemmas out of it. So we have a whole program at my center called Ethics and the Arts, where we use art as a vehicle to discuss ethical problems. So yes, you're absolutely right. Artists have spent time throughout history asking those kinds of questions. Many of the great pieces of art in history pose some ethical dilemma within them as part of what makes them interesting as artistic pieces.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because I'm obviously not within that environment. It's not my area of study, so I didn't know that was happening. But it's really cool to hear that it is happening, and it's so useful, because you think it'd be a cool idea and realize, no, wait, this is already being done. This is already being explored. So that's really cool to hear.
When you and your friends leave a movie, you sit in the car driving home afterwards or having a beer, discussing the ethical. You don't think of it as discussing the ethical dilemma, but I, as an ethicist, bring my lens to it. It's remarkable how much of that conversation is around what someone should have done or shouldn't have done, and whether this was right or that was right, or how could they have done this. Ethics is part of how we think about these kinds of experiences.
And they're fun. Like, people really enjoy having these conversations, and having a fun environment like a movie or a book to discuss and explore, and then having a fun discussion after it is what tickles us intellectually, and it makes us excited.
Totally.
And I want to kind of segue this a bit into the other question I had about your original answer to the stopping AI as a program. That you mentioned there that there was AI is often trained by human-generated data sets. And within our data sets, like you said, it's impossible to not have a bias. I've seen suggestions and articles that say, it's impossible for us to have a form of government that'll actually benefit both the individuality and the community to the best possible compromise, because we are biased. You have an individual bias. So we should generate a general AI which could kind of find this bias between the two. And I want to know what your reaction is on that, because like you said, the AI is generated by the bias. So would it then also have a bias and therefore not be practical? Or is there a way in which we can use a kind of a third party that doesn't have this human factor to try and make either as many people happy or stand out, the balance between individual freedom and community?
It's a wonderful question, and we don't know the answer, but I'll tell you what I think. And that is, I can't imagine a more frightening proposition than asking artificial intelligence to make human-based decisions for 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, our assumption is that compromise that you're speaking about is possible. We just can't do it because we're too biased. But it may be the nature of human life that it's not possible intrinsically. And if that's true, then asking AI to do it is just asking for trouble. The second thing is, there is a problem that's going to be part of AI for the foreseeable future. I can't speak for 100 years from now. Who knows what life will look like? But there are many assumptions that we make about life that we don't make explicit. So AI doesn't have any of those assumptions, and we can't remember or guess or anticipate what all of them are. And this has been shown again and again in AI in really obvious and blatant ways. There was a case of a group of students who were supposed to create a tic-tac-toe algorithm, simple, just an exercise. And of course, if you create a good tic-tac-toe algorithm, then then when we put my algorithm against your algorithm, it should be a draw every single time. Because if you want to create a draw, you can always create a draw. So all of a sudden, one of these algorithms began winning every game. And they said, how is this possible? So they went into the system to look at what happened. And this is what the algorithm did. It learned how to turn off the other algorithm. So it would go in, turn off the other algorithm. That algorithm would forfeit. It would turn it back on. Then they would start a new game. It would turn it off. That algorithm would forfeit. It would turn it back on. And it just did this endlessly. So it won every game. Now, if I said to you, Beatrice, let's play tic-tac-toe. We sat down and I punched your lights out. And when you woke up, I said, well, you lost the first game. Let's start the second one. And I punched your lights out. I mean, you'd say, what is wrong with you? Because you and I know what the rules are. That algorithm didn't know what the rules were. It only knew the rules that it was told. So it took this thing that none of us would ever think is legitimate or could do, but it did exactly what it was told to do. Win every game. That's what it was told to do. Try to win every game. So what are all of these little assumptions that you and I take for granted? You know, you and I right now are talking, we're listening to each other, we're nodding to encourage the other person. I wait for your question. I mean, there are 1,000 rules about how to have a conversation, and algorithms aren't going to know any of those rules unless they're given each one explicitly. But we learn them not through explicit telling, but by modeling. We learn by watching other people. So a very worrisome part of AI is, what is it that AI doesn't know? You know, if you tell AI cure cancer, there's an easy way to cure cancer: kill everybody with cancer, right? And then cancer is eliminated, right? It's questions like that, but not in those, of course, blatant ways. Those are the things we know to tell AI. It's little things. So that is a bigger problem to me than AI eventually, maybe someday, destroying all of us. It's going to take a long, long time before AI can interact with us in ways that has that kind of subtlety.